If you were lucky enough to be PC gaming in the late 90s and early 2000s, there's a good shot that you were familiar with Blizzard and Starcraft. Back then, Starcraft was a mainstay on our PC, and it was almost always installed, and at the time, Blizzard felt like one of the untouchable studios that would exclusively be releasing incredible genre-defining games. While I don't really want to get into their modern situation, at the time, they did not miss. Starcraft is a legendary RTS in an era full of legendary RTSs. It was a huge part of early esports and online multiplayer, but it also had a massive 30-chapter campaign, nearly double that if you include the expansion Brood War. The plot of Starcraft is this sci-fi epic that's set during the war between three huge factions, the human Terran, the monstrous Zerg, and the mysterious Protoss. I'm pretty sure it's still the best-selling RTS ever made, and for all that praise, you'd think it would be on other platforms besides PC. PC studios like Blizzard would often port their games to consoles, but this would often come with some major compromises. While other Blizzard games like Diablo and Warcraft did show up on the PS1, Starcraft Brood War was ported to the N64 of all things. I wouldn't have expected Nintendo of all companies to be the ones putting the gory and violent world of Starcraft on their relatively kid-friendly console. Though the 64 did have games like Turok, generally speaking, it was considered more of a family-friendly system. I do imagine, though, that the slight boost in power on the Nintendo 64 made it possible as opposed to the PS1. I've long considered StarCraft 64 as an interesting anecdote in the Nintendo 64's history, since it's, to this day, the only console release of one of the most influential games of all time. Forget about the remaster, we're doing StarCraft on 64. StarCraft on 64, like a lot of console conversions, features some unique aspects that make it stand apart from the original game. StarCraft had loads of these small changes made throughout the 64 version, and I can go over some of them here. To start, the game's dialogue has been heavily edited. You can see it here in parts throughout the video, but one highlight includes Raynor calling Mengsk a rutabaga. All cursing is removed from the script.
I just can't risk you falling under their influence.
There also was one segment in the Brood War campaign where the Marine breaks the fourth wall and directly references the N64. And when it comes to the dozen or so CGI cutscenes, all but one of them has been cut and used as the intro sequence. The intro cinematic has been completely chopped down and gutted, and it's really blurry too. In the place of video cinematics, there are these abridged images with text captions. The text is mostly new, but some of them reuse spoken dialogue from those cutscenes. Due to the 64's small cartridge size, almost all of the game's iconic voice acting has been cut.
My life for ire!
Most units will have a handful of lines in the game, and it's honestly such a shame because the dialogue in StarCraft is iconic. The dialogue from units and mission briefs in the original StarCraft made that world so much more memorable and added so much to the experience. In my opinion, losing that voice acting is probably the biggest sacrifice that they had to make to get the game on 64. Blizzard would always put these joke voice lines in when you click a unit too much, and in StarCraft 64, every unit is only given one.
Reporting for duty. You ain't from around here, are you?
Because there's no audio voice lines, gameplay will sometimes just abruptly pause to show a text box instead of a subtitle on the side of the screen. Missing out on the audio kind of changed my experience in a way. Without the exciting action, the cinematics feel a little bit like a solemn account of a war, instead of these sort of dramatic moments. The original cutscenes, as charming as they are, do have a bit of age to them. They don't look that great anymore, and they're kind of hard to take seriously. And so the text and images kind of make it easier to swallow in a way. But don't get me wrong, I would never trade these text boxes for the actual dialogue.
Clearly, Tassadar has failed us. You must not.
One last thing to note when it comes to the audio is that the music selection has been cut down to about 2 tracks per race. Which is unfortunate though, because the soundtrack in StarCraft is actually really solid. StarCraft 64 does technically have one exclusive music track. In the original game, each race had its own mission brief song, but in StarCraft 64, they all share one generic one. RTS games on PC tend to use loads and loads of hotkeys, so I think it's time that we should talk about the N64 controller and how they adapted that to control Starcraft. Being a PC port, Starcraft 64 has to use everything the N64 controller has when it comes to buttons. A and B function like a left and right mouse click, while the C buttons are used to replace the control panel. RTS games on PC are notorious for having tons of actions going all at once, and you have to do all of that with a controller now to do anything at a reasonable pace. In order to move the camera, you have to hold the Z button down and move the stick. It's the fastest way to look around, since scrolling to the minimap or to the sides of the screen is a lot more inconvenient. But constantly squeezing that Z button was starting to kill my hand. It's not the worst thing ever, but it's not exactly ergonomic. Typically, I would kind of swap between the original N64 controller and the Brawler 64 third-party controller. The ergonomics would be a little bit better, and it let me access the D-pad. It's definitely something to consider if you want to play the game for yourself.
Nuclear launch detected.
Having 6 face buttons as opposed to the PS1's 4 means that most unit commands fit comfortably on the C buttons. Despite that, you can't make units patrol an area or queue any of their actions in a row. I thought I figured out how to queue actions at one point, but it never seemed to work properly. Because you couldn't queue up commands, I would constantly lose where I put worker units like SCVs, since they couldn't be queued to do something else after they finished building something. Holding R and L would let you organize units into groups or set locations on the map to quickly move the camera to. Finding locations on the map was pretty useful if you needed to go back to the base and check up on your units and stuff like that, but the unit groups I'd often choose to not use because they would be hard to handle. Z plus the C buttons let you select a squad, but Z is also constantly being pressed to move the camera, and C is constantly being pressed to move the units. So if you set Z plus C to a squad, odds are that you'll miss input and select another group. But still, I think that if you are going to port StarCraft to a console from that generation, it probably would have to be the N64. The stick is probably the most well suited to these small motions of selecting specific units in a small area. I think the work they made to have the game fully playable on N64, especially on an N64 controller, is pretty commendable. Obviously, you're not going to be climbing the Brood War ladder, but at least you can play through the rest of the game with a reasonable control setup. Unsurprisingly, StarCraft 64 has some pretty heavy performance issues. Visually, StarCraft 64 looks pretty rough. Every sprite seems to have been pretty compressed, and the frame rate of the game will also chug like crazy at times. It seemed to me that certain map themes would lag more than others. The volcanic char maps tended to be a lot laggier than some of the other ones, whereas some large maps on the desert theme ran okay. The game seems to run between 20 to 30 frames per second, but at times it absolutely crawls down to like 8. A lot of the times I would complete a level, move into the next, and then just feel a wave of lag come onto me. I think that due to the controls and performance, the developers increased the maximum squad size from 12 to 18. Since you can control 18 units at once, it does make it a little bit easier to manage. Having that many units sounds nice until you realize that StarCraft has notoriously bad pathing. It doesn't really justify the experience, but StarCraft 64 does stand apart from the original game with this little button right here. Split screen multiplayer. I accidentally recorded the footage at a lower resolution, so let's pretend that you're playing with an RF signal. Multiplayer in StarCraft 64 features a good selection of the original maps, and it cuts the screen in half. The resolution and frame rate also gets a split though, meaning all of the problems that you had in the single player are made even worse here. You can either play 2 players with one team and share the resources, or you can play a regular versus mode with your own armies. Because of the way the co-op works, you get to play as a hybrid team, which is pretty cool to see. I'm not like incredibly good at Starcraft to begin with, and we had a real hard time just trying to beat the bots. After a few games of multiplayer, we hopped into the destruction minigame here. I could imagine people having a bit of fun with these minigames, but maybe not the actual Starcraft modes. In the end, this exclusive multiplayer isn't exactly special or anything, but if you want to be overly optimistic, you could say you played Starcraft in widescreen years before the remaster came out. If you're already familiar with Starcraft, you might have noticed that the UI has been completely redone here. The menus all have a new purple mechanical design. I assume they're trying to create this sort of catch-all UI that worked for all of the races at once. The most noticeable change in the menus is done to the mission brief room. There's no need for multiple faces and scrolling text when you aren't even able to listen to them talk.
I don't like this at all.
The big themed control panels on the bottom of the screen have also been completely removed, probably to improve the visibility. Unit health is exclusively shown in numbers, and so you can't really get a good idea of how your squad is doing at a glance without looking at their tiny little health bars. Also, you can't even see the fun little kill counter that every unit would have in the original game. Strangely enough, this one window to select buildings and units has its theming still, for every race. Just having one window is a bit weird to me. I wonder if they intended to keep the UIs themed, but it was maybe just a bit too cluttered. So in the original Starcraft, you could always press enter and open a chat box, but in single player, that chat box was used to input cheat codes. You could use these cheat codes at any time in game, and if you wanted to, you could cheat your way through the entire story mode. Things like power overwhelming and there is no cow level are sort of like iconic phrases to Blizzard, but they're sadly not here in the 64 version. Being a console game, there's no need for a keyboard or chat box, and the cheats therefore have been moved to their own menu. When you first open the cheat menu though, you'll find that it's completely empty. To unlock cheats in Starcraft 64, you have to find them in secret spots in the campaign. You can also find them by beating the first 3 episodes or all 6 episodes of the campaign. Some of them are pretty hard to find, and a lot of them I did have to look online to find the spots. It is cool that there is some extra dialogue for the cheats though. This one guy will tell you not to shoot him, and he rewards you for sparing him by giving you a cheat for instant upgrades.
Oh yeah.
The thing is though, not having cheats available changes StarCraft in a huge way. Since you can't cheat your way through the campaign, if you want to skip past a particularly hard chapter, you just aren't given that option. Plus, the game will outright block you from progressing through the story if you use the cheats that you do have access to. If you want to experience the story of StarCraft and Brood War, you're just gonna have to get good and play the game yourself. Considering how much I cheated to mess around while playing the game as a kid, it's honestly a massive change that alters the relationship someone could have with the whole StarCraft experience. Not being allowed to use cheats also meant I had another big issue. Since Starcraft 64 has an exclusive co-op story mission that can only be unlocked by beating every chapter in the campaign. The mission is called Resurection IV, and it actually ties in directly with Starcraft 2's story. That meant that if you wanted to play Resurection 4 without any Game Shark or whatever in its originally released version, you had to play through Starcraft 64 in its entirety. And that's exactly what I set out to do here.
Torakalah! 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 Torakalah!
The first episode in StarCraft starts with the Terran. Forgive me for the lack of a lot of the early mission footage. For whatever reason, my capture card was mad at my 64, and most of my footage looks like this. When it comes to the Terran campaign, it's easygoing at first since it's just trying to teach you how to play. After the attack at New Gettysburg threatened to make my N64 explode, the remaining Terran missions weren't so bad. I got through the Terran missions pretty quickly and moved on to the Zerg campaign. Every time I would start a new episode and the levels would get small again, I'd be very happy to see the lag subside for a bit. I mean, look at those drones move. In the Zerg campaign, I pretty much just relied on Mutalisks to do everything. There were very few things a wave of 18 mutas couldn't handle. My main issue came with dealing with hives and overlords. In Starcraft 64, pressing R will let you quickly select all attacking type units. If pressing R again will cycle through the types of units that are in your view. With this system in mind, overlords count as attacking units because they're like dropships, which meant that pressing R to select all units would also select your overlords. When you're playing on 64, you can also press Z and R to bring up a quick command for your base. The quick command menu lets you quickly upgrade or build any units that you want. But due to the way that hatcheries spawn individual larvae, it meant that you would only be selecting one larva at a time. If you use the hotkey, you'd have to press ZR for every single larva you'd want to mutate, pretty much negating the feature altogether for the Zerg. Last in the base game is the Protoss. Starcraft occasionally has these missions where you're handling a small squad through the level instead of the usual base and army building. In this one level, you're meant to be handling the High Templar to use their Psystorm ability to shred through the Zerg, but my micro was just not there. You can cycle through units by tapping R like I mentioned, so I'd be constantly mashing that button hoping to land on the High Templar that I wanted. But since you can't see unit portraits when you select more than one, it made it really hard for me to stop at the right time during a hectic fight. At least by the end of the campaign, I had access to carriers, so I could rest easy knowing that I could just wait long enough to get a fleet of these things to tear through any base. After that, Tassadar crashed in the Overmind and the Starcraft base game was done. By the time I'd finished the base game campaign, I was thinking of calling it quits. I wanted to beat the whole game at first, but I was just having such a hard time getting through the lag and the controls. I had a pretty good idea of how the game was, and I'd played through half the game, and I felt like I was ready to make this video. And you know what? I took a bit of a break from the game, a few weeks or something, and I came back ready to sit down and finish the thing.
Get on with it.
I played through the entire Brood War campaign, which, by the way, requires that you have the N64's expansion pack. It might have been a mistake, but let me take you through it. Thankfully, we're starting with the Protoss again, and we're just kind of having a good time here. Most of the time, I could just enjoy the new map themes and send out some Reavers that would take care of most of the enemy bases. For whatever reason, snow levels seem to just run a lot better on StarCraft 64. I was actually having a bit of fun again until I got to the Battle of Braxis level. It was another squad-based level, which is a lot of trouble for me. I think the level layout and everything just kind of made it hard to manage my little groups of Protoss without making mistakes. There were just so many missile turrets and siege tanks, and units were just getting picked out by accident all the time. The whole point of the mission is you're trying to destroy these generators, and the second last one was just covered in missiles and Goliaths which fire missiles, and I just had no good way to clear it. This one mission is probably the most difficult one I had in the entire run at this point. I had a bit more fun getting through those last few missions, but then it was time to say goodbye. I've always preferred playing Protoss to the others in StarCraft, so it's sad to have all the Protoss gameplay stuck right in the middle of the game. The Terran campaign in Brood War was pretty unmemorable to me. Half of the time I was playing it on my CRT instead, so a lot of my footage is just not there, but I just don't remember much about it anyway. Partway through the campaign, the mission split up into two separate options, and I was worried that I would have to do both campaign levels to get the full completion, but thankfully it didn't matter. There's a good set of levels here though. The core hall levels also tended to run pretty well, so that was good. Unlocking the cheat here is actually great. You find this bear and you have to give him a hug by surrounding him with a bunch of units, and then he gives you the code. Despite some long missions, the Terran campaign in Brood War went by alright, But it was the final episode that really put me through the ringer. Like I mentioned before, the Zerg in particular aren't really well suited for the control scheme. So you'll be happy to know that the final Zerg campaign took me a third of my entire playtime. Due to the 64's cumbersome controls, I couldn't take advantage of any ability-focused units at the Zerg's disposal. And along with the squishy units that the Zerg typically have, I was pretty much forced to just make waves and waves of Hydralisks and Guardians to just try and chip away at enemy bases. There were missions where I was running the map dry in my efforts to just clear out all of the enemies. The further I got into the campaign, the longer the missions took. Save scumming was my only lifeline for this final episode. Brood War really only gets harder and harder, which usually means there are more and more big maps with loads of enemies to churn through. Because of that, the game also lags like crazy. Sitting there watching my drones slowly gather resources was painful to watch. Once I got to the second last level, I did know that I had to beat the mission within 5 minutes to get the secret bonus level, Dark Origin. The level wasn't that bad, but I immediately died, so I had to do that all over again because I just didn't save. So at this point, I was watching some speedruns on YouTube and noticed that you can easily cheese Dark Origin by getting Zeratul to the beacon at the end of the level. I thought it would be fun to try this out in Starcraft 64. I got him in the dropship and I sent him over there, and it wasn't flawlessly executed or anything, but I had accomplished the skip. Or so I thought. Somehow, Zeratul died in the cutscene. Due to the way Starcraft 64 breaks up dialogue with text boxes instead of audio, it meant that enemies can still attack you during the split second between messages. And because of that, I couldn't do the speedrun strat because enemies would be standing beside me, shooting at me between text boxes. Zeratul will just get gunned down in between dialogue, and if he dies at any point, even during the cutscene, it still counts as a game over. I wonder if I'm the only one that noticed this difference in the port. Because of that, I had to come back to the level and do it the old-fashioned way.
Make it slow.
The final mission, Omega, is a giant 3-on-1 match where you have to turtle as hard as you can in order to survive long enough to build up an army and wipe out the enemy bases. Since there are now 3 giant armies to get through, this level runs like the hottest garbage. They also do censor the Queen Bee of the Universe line, but what did you expect? I did actually notice one other small difference with this map. The small Protoss camp on the east side of the map was just not there. For some reason, they just forgot to put it there. The last base here was a bit of a struggle to get through, but by then I had more than enough resources that I knew what to do with, and I could just finish the final mission. Funny enough, the ending cutscene is presented in opposite order from the original game. I'd successfully 100% completed Starcraft 64, meaning I'd gotten all of the cheats and cleared every campaign level. That meant that Resurection IV, the exclusive level, was finally mine to play. It's fine. The main draw of Resurection IV is that you can play a 2-player co-op squad mission. I don't know why, but I thought that Starcraft 64 would let you play campaign missions in co-op, but it never let you do that, so this is sort of the closest thing I got to that. It's actually a pretty expansive squad level. It took me about an hour to finish, and it gives you both a Protoss and Terran squad. I did end up just playing it with 2 controllers by myself, so maybe it doesn't actually take a full hour to complete. And if you do want to play the map yourself, I'm pretty sure there's community maps for the PC version. I think the most interesting part of the mission is how it leads into StarCraft 2. The idea that this random level stuck on a Nintendo 64 technically features plot details is really funny to me. Sure, you could summarize those details in one sentence, but who cares? I like how contrived it is. So that was my experience playing StarCraft on Nintendo 64. After playing through the game and taking over 60 hours to get through the whole thing, what are my main takeaways? First of all, maybe probably don't do it yourself. I feel like I maybe am in a small niche of fans who are willing to sit through it. If I wanted to replay StarCraft in the future, I don't think I would ever bother with this, and there is still a whole remaster I just chose not to play. But in a weird way, I think I still had fun with it. Maybe I've developed just a mild resistance to bad port performance, but I do think StarCraft is just such a good game at its core that it doesn't really matter. So what do you guys think about StarCraft 64? I'm genuinely curious if anyone had their first StarCraft experience on Nintendo 64. Maybe now that Xbox owns Blizzard, StarCraft will be playable on a controller again and will come full circle. Thank you so much for sitting through this whole video. If you made it to the end here, don't forget to subscribe if you enjoyed the video, leave a comment, like it, all that stuff. Any of those things help support the channel and keep me a bit motivated to make more of these things. Thanks again for watching, and take care.
Pylons.